Just a note that starting in September 2024, Mage the Podcast has switched to a 2-episode-a-month format as we start doing videos for YouTube and other platforms. I'll announce on the podcast when those videos start going up. My plan is for sometime in late October. I have a studio to build, and my reach is well beyond my grasp when it comes to that kind of construction. If you're a patron, please check out the Patreon feed for an interview I did with Sater about reviewing the Mage zeroth edition manuscript on my recent trip to Seattle. Also, it gets a shout out at the end, but Pook is looking for people to join their Changeling 30 project. Please visit the Changeling the Podcast Discord for more information if you would like to participate. This is the last of the podcast episodes based on Gen Con 2024, so if you're tired of those are coming to an end. If you're curious what's coming up next, I released the list of the next 38 or so episodes that I am planning to the executive producers. But as always, if you have episode ideas or topics that you'd like to see covered, by all means, email us at magethepodcast@gmail.com or drop a comment in our Discord. We're always looking for ideas. And with that, on with the show.
Hi, Mage fans. This is your host, Terry Robinson with Mage the Podcast. And joining me today is Pook from Changeling the Podcast. Pook, how you doing?
I'm full of salad, therefore I'm great.
Yeah. As is commonly the way, as a secret boggin, every time I have Pook over, I'm like, here are 3 foods. If I don't offer you 3 foods, then the geesh that requires you to, in return, produce a podcast with me would not take effect.
Are you a secret boggin at this point? I feel like it's pretty out in the open.
No, I don't. Yeah, I don't think it's secret. I want to be an issue. I want to be that storyteller, but I just don't spend enough time with it. It's mostly a case of me trying to create space for other people's stories, which feels more bogginy. And I am a gossipy bitch to the end. And that's
that also fits.
Yeah, that's the button I really wind up hitting. I do wish I had the ability to work 3 times as fast or twice as fast when no one was looking, because usually it's the other way around, that if someone's not looking, I'm like, well, I could do this. Or
you could play compulsive games of Canasto, which is what I've been doing all week, because apparently I'm a 70-year-old former mobster.
I have a friend who is coping with the current election by getting into competitive bridge.
Same principle.
Exactly. We all have our drugs. What was it? Bertrand Russell, he said he lost friends to one of 3 things. God, alcohol, or chess.
He also apparently had really bad halitosis, so it was probably 4 for him.
Oh, really? Yeah. Oh, that's disappointing. Anyway, so before recording today, you and I got to thumb through Mage zeroth edition, which is the term of art that we're using for, thanks to friend of the show, Charles Siegel, for the version of Mage that never got released. It was the one that the Wick brothers and one other gentleman worked on, deemed unplayable.
I'm still tingling, by the way, from flipping through the pages.
Yeah, flipping through the artifact.
Seeing the red lines.
And I keep using the term artifact because that is a term I picked up from Michael Parker, who uses it to refer to, like, when you buy a game, what is the thing that you get? Like, that may just be a book. It may be a book and dice and a quick start guide. It may be a dice tower. It may be associated other things. So I've just started referring to any physical instantiation of a game as an artifact, which makes it sound way more important than it actually is.
I like that, though. I mean, well, I think games can be important. Maybe not every game is an artifact, but some of them are. And there are things so flipping through that, it gave me the same sense of awe and inspiration that I would have if I were looking through first edition Changeling or my copy of Dungeons and Dragons from when I was 9, that kind of thing.
It really feels like there's a unitary vision in there, even
Yes.
if it's not fully assembled, and that is delightful.
Yeah.
You get the sense that someone is really in command of the world that they're trying to create. What were 1 or 2 things that stuck out to you in it? I know one that I thought was fascinating, just going through, was time 1.5. The original magic system divided magic into kind of effects and rituals, and the rituals were tied to your avatar family.
Which is a thing.
Yeah, which is a
apparently.
thing, which I would be fine if they brought back in some way, shape, or form.
But also not Avatar family, Essence family.
Essence family, because avatar is not really used as a term in there.
Not once.
But I think that would be an interesting alternative to the traditions, that you would have this culturally informed thing, but also at the same time, there are certain people who felt a basic tug to find people like them, but in a magical sense, as opposed to a cultural or political sense. Mm-hmm. And having a bunch of different axes of association, I think would be neat. Someone could reasonably be part of the Sisters of Hippolyta and be part of the Verbena and be part of the Morriganian Essence family or something.
It's kind of like when you're part of an academic organization and they ask you how many subdivision newsletters you want to sign up for, and you just check 15 boxes at once out of 50. But yeah, do you think that that would change in some ways the process of like character building and hashing out interaction? Because in zeroth edition, the traditions seem like even more monolithic than any of the others.
Oh, certainly.
So if they were split apart in that way, if they were kind of maintained as these two separate, very coherent axes of Splat, how do you think that would change the feel of like going through the process of building a mage?
I think there's a couple of different things. One, I think it would require you to put your boogie dollar down real early, in the sense that like the families have their own internal agenda. And it seems to be more focused on personal refinement, enlightenment, and power. Whereas the traditions in this zeroth edition seem more interested in dealing with a mortal group and cultivating ascension by controlling the mindscape of the consensus in that way. So I think it asks you fundamentally to say, do you want to be internally or externally focused? But there's a lot of overlap between the two, because families will have Essence families will have agenda that probably will influence the world around them as a side effect or as a way of getting what they want. Whereas with the traditions, it may be a bit more direct. And it's also interesting because in this edition, we have the technocracy, even though it is nowhere defined.
Yeah, like I didn't notice any real like Ascension War kind of stuff. It seems very much more in the realm of philosophical wrangling rather than actual fighting in the streets with katanas and whatnot.
Yeah, but you and I have looked through it, and I think we're going to try and play it at some point.
Yeah, why not?
We'll do an actual play of Mage Zeroth Edition. But yeah, I found something that I thought was fascinating. One of the gems that you had come up with were the 5 words that begin with the letter A for the different levels of Ascension?
The evolutes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So at Arate's 1, 4, 7, 10, and then 10 again, there are these sort of definitions of, I guess you would call it substages in the journey to Ascension, where kind of different effects kick in.
Yeah.
So Awakening is at Arate 1. You are aware you could do magic. Arate 4 is the one where you, Agentia, I think it was
Is that the one where you
Agentia.
set off, you learn to set off chains of events?
Yeah, you can offend Tipper Gore was the example that was used with song lyrics. At 7, you start getting Arcane, which is called Mystery in here. At 10, you become immortal, and then at some point, while also at 10, you ascend, and that's left undefined in some way. But the other thing that I liked was the auspiced damage, which is an entire new category of damage that I didn't know I needed before. But if somebody witnesses you getting injured, it's not as severe as aggravated, but it can't just be coincidentally healed because they saw you. You got hurt. You got cut by whatever. And you're going to have to use vulgar magic to heal that. So I liked that.
Yeah, and I will scan this, and we will continue our quest through the text.
There's a lot of ideas that are like, they were just put out there, and then they never appeared again.
Yeah. And the glory is in a modern game where you don't necessarily have to have a unitary world because you're only going to do 6 or 7 sessions. That's fine.
Aww. It's true.
Yeah. Like our Invisible Sun game that we will hopefully one day finish.
Someday we're going to find that damn egg.
We're going to find that damn
for that wolf spider woman. I forget what she was now, but
yeah, the dead woman.
Like that. Yeah.
Who got a hall pass to come back from the City of the Dead to not quite avenge, but be like, well, you need to find my kid egg now.
Was that before or after we blew up the Candy People factory?
The Candy People factory.
There was like a cult in a candy factory or something. I can't remember.
There was the Contra Dance group.
Oh yeah, that was it.
Yeah, and then you were being pursued, and then you disappeared a person.
Yeah. Sorry about that.
Yeah, and that's what kicked off the.
Sorry
the whole,
to his wife.
That's what kicked off the whole egg story. And if that doesn't make sense, listeners, I don't know what would.
Invisible Sun, take a drink.
Yeah. I was attacked on a different podcast because I said, "This is like an Invisible Sun, take a drink," and they're like, "Did you just invent your own take a drink?" And I'm like, "Person, this, I have been making this bad joke for years. Thank you very much. I did not invent this for the purposes of this particular interview."
It happened.
Yeah. But we're going to talk through the games. I got to play at Gen Con.
Yeah.
And figure out if any of them have any bits to steal for Mage.
So I think I've heard of 3 of these, and I would say I am reasonably slightly, and not at all familiar with them. And those would be, in order, Fate of the Norns, Cyberpunk 2077, and Modern Arcana.
Yeah. Going through them, I think each of them gave me something different that I would want to steal for a Mage game. Modern Arcana, which is just 5th edition in a modern world where magic and guns both kind of exist, but things are kind of normal, taught me that people will seemingly play anything. So this was a game where we operated a coffee shop, and I started the game late, and they picked a city that everyone there had heard of, but no one there lived in. And that was Philadelphia. And I thought, and then I come over to sit down at the table, and I'm like, let me drop some knowledge on you. So the storyteller quickly changed the story, so we all had to go to Scranton. And it involved a cult who was using the power of coffee beans to create this hyper distillate that allowed you to separate the essence of an object into 2 parts. So by distilling the wakefulness of caffeine, the idea of it, not necessarily the chemical component to it, they were going to awaken a sleeping god. The flip side of that is that left the beans that had the wakefulness extracted from them as kind of like a super somnophoric. So people would drink this coffee and then they would be knocked out for like 18 hours, which, as someone who's had great difficulty sleeping recently, sounds like the best time.
Just as an aside, I mean, I like the idea that if you extract the wakefulness, it leaves the somnophoric behind, but I don't necessarily know that. I feel like it would be a more asymmetric process, and what you'd be left with is, not to put too fine a point on it, colonic accelerant. But
that would be not unreasonable, because as you mentioned, the colonic accelerant is unrelated to the stimulant quality, because decaf also makes you have to go, which I appreciate as someone who both enjoys decaf and likes being regular. So this was my first time with a 5e-like game, and there was the antagonist who I did not want to engage in direct combat, so I grappled them. And then they shot me with a gun. Oh. An elf shot me with a gun. Now, the thing to me is, I thought the whole notion of grappling was that it kind of disabled your foe, but apparently not. It just prevents them from moving. It doesn't prevent them from acting. So I was shot and I died because I was a first level character. I had 8 hit points and I took 8 damage. This is when I learned that made me not die, but it made me dying. So the present progressive came in there.
Does it do the 3 rolls to revive yourself?
Something like that. Yeah. The storyteller just kind of fudged it because he didn't want me to die, literally in my first round of combat ever with a 5th edition game. And this was the system that underlies Modern Arcana versus The Crow, who I also did an interview, which I'm never going to release, because the person was like, this system lets you do anything. I'm like, sure, in a kind of boring way. That interview is never going to make it out into the wild.
Awkward.
But yeah, the thing it taught me was that systems that can do anything often can do nothing. So it made me quickly realize what I didn't like in a game. And I'm glad I got to do that.
So what would you take from that and apply to Mage in that context?
I think the biggest thing I would take is any attempt at converting Mage to 5e is fundamentally fraud and for bad people.
Well, because people often point to Mage as a system where you can do anything.
Yeah.
But I think it's more reasonable to say that. Maybe not eminently reasonable, but more reasonable. So, like, where do you think the guardrails would have to be?
So, the one thing I did like about the system is the problem with Mage is you frequently need to get at least 1 success to do anything. But it was not uncommon that the storyteller would be like, hey, I want you to make a wisdom check or an arcana check or something where you roll a 20-sided die. They have a difficulty number in their head. You have a modifier that stems from your basic attributes. Maybe you have a +3 wisdom modifier and then a +2 further modifier, and you're trained, so you get to roll twice or something like that. The thing I would probably add to Mage is if something is very simple or something you've very much trained at, roll twice and take the better one, or do what the rote quality in Chronicles of Darkness does, where once per roll you get to re-roll all non-success dice. And that can be up to your entire pool. Or do what some other games do and have difficulty 0 rolls, but with some sort of complication. So you would have something where you say you want to get the information out of someone, roll difficulty 0. and you roll difficulty 0, you get no successes. You still get the information, but now your threat to tell no one did not stick. And now upon leaving, they are going to notify their bosses or call the authorities or something. Whereas if you had gotten 2 or 3 successes, that would have stuck. So the one thing I would change is the fact that there's kind of a floor in difficulty in Mage, in that if you have a small dice pool and it's a high difficulty or medium difficulty and you need to get at least 1 success, that kind of bones you in a bunch of cases. So if you still want things to move on, you can have something that is 0 difficulty, but if you don't get a certain number of successes, some complication or bad thing is going to step in. Otherwise, I really have nothing that I would steal with it. I do kind of like hit points on occasion. That's about it, just because things tend to be unkillable or tend to explode a lot in World of Darkness games. It's really hard to have that slow, gradually whittling down and the realization we're not going to win this fight, so let's leave.
Yeah.
But then again, I thought that's the way a 5e game would work. It did not in this case, because again, while grappling an elf, I was shot.
Yeah.
Which is not a phrase I thought I would ever use.
5e is a little bit, I mean, I like 5e. I've played a lot of 5e. I think it's certainly better than 4e. But yeah, one of the issues I have with it is just the combat where, like, especially when, for whatever reason, your character is not well suited for that combat and you were just swinging and swinging and swinging and nothing is happening and you're being hit and hit and hit and slowly dying, and it just feels very futile. And I already have enough futility in my life. So
yeah, there were definitely cases though where there was a difficulty 4 check or something that was used, which at one point you're like, why
bother?
Yeah. Well, I think people enjoy the ritual of rolling the die and seeing in a ludic sense what happens, and then the storyteller giving it to you anyway. And with a D20 system, assuming you don't literally roll a 1, you can always kind of justify to yourself, oh, it was only difficulty 2 or something like that. Where in World of Darkness, we don't really have the notion of difficulty 0.
Yeah.
Where everything requires at least 1 success, or you would say just give it to them. And I have been in games both where it is kind of fun to roll for no reason, but it is also empowering to get the automatic win. When the storyteller goes, oh, you have 12 dice, don't even bother rolling. I've certainly encountered both, but it would be nice to have both in your tool chest. And right now, World of Darkness really only gives you 1. So that is the one thing that I would take from that.
That's fair.
Plus, it helped me rule out that I really have no interest in getting any of the everyday hero games.
Okay.
They seemed remarkably lame.
Terry, you already are an everyday hero.
Oh, thank you. The one exception to that may be I'm kind of curious about the Pacific Rim game, because I'm always curious about games where you have a mech. I would like to see what that little mech character sheet looks like.
Kaiju is waifu.
That sounds like one of David Rees' failed palindromes. Have you ever seen those?
No.
Oh, okay.
Oh, that's brilliant, though. I love it.
For a number of years, David Rees used to release not quite palindromes, which were almost better than actual palindromes. So like one of them would be like Toyota yogurt. And another one was Dorita Drake's E-card arrived.
Interesting.
Another one was Antarctic ice melted, delete mice cantata.
Oh, you're just making things up.
Oh, yeah.
So can you tell me about Yazeba's bed and breakfast?
Yazeba's bed and breakfast. Friend of the show, Monica Speck, and I frequently talk about how games that are listed as rules light are actually not games. They're just modified improv prompts. And this was one of those. And at the start of every scene, we would pick a scenario and you would pick a character. And this was a bed and breakfast operated by like a crusty old wizard. And the guests were a group of hyper-intelligent rabbits, a demon child, a earth elemental, a sentient cat, a fairy queen, all sorts of mythic characters.
An invisible sun B&B.
Yeah.
Basically.
This more felt like a storybook Mother Goose B&B, just in terms of the characters. But yeah. And now I want to do an Invisible Sun bed and breakfast.
I'm in.
I did have one really weird scene in a previous game where there was a character that had never been seen to move, but obviously was found in different places. Just spent several sessions talking about how they were getting ready for a trip. And all they had been seen was staring out a window for seemingly months on end. And then one day they were just gone. And that is one of the most invisible sun things that had ever happened.
I wish it were that easy.
Yeah. But the way Yazeba's bed and breakfast worked was you would pick this character, you would have goals for the scene, and you would have things that allowed you to accumulate little tokens and things where you would spend tokens to do them. So the first one we did was we were dealing with Hey That Kid, who is a demon child who wasn't sure what to do on a rainy day. And I chose the character of the Warren of Rabbits, of hyper-intelligent rabbits. And have you ever had a Pearls Before Swine RPGing moment where you're like, I roleplayed the shit out of this and no one appreciated it?
Yeah, once in a while.
Yeah. I strictly spoke as the rabbits as a Greek chorus in rhyming couplets. And I would use my hand to indicate that one rabbit was starting a sentence and another rabbit was finishing it. Like it was a group shared mind. And I spent the time as the rabbits talking about how to you a rainy day is merely an annoyance, but for a warren of rabbits, it's a flood risk. As a prey species, your child plays at war, but for us, no rabbit dies of old age. And no one at the table was biting on this. They were just like, what the literal shit are you talking about?
Oh.
But what it did was, so for instance, the kid started with 2 times as many tokens as there were players present. And as you went through, you would do things to kind of bleed off the kid's excess energy. And if at the end of a certain number of activities, the kid hadn't been tired out, then the kid broke something in the house. And there were a bunch of different ways to have that manifest. And some characters could propose activities. Some characters could say something witty. As the bunny, 2 of my special moves were I could spend a token to wiggle my nose cutely, or I could spend a token to give everyone present a carrot.
Useful.
Yeah.
I mean,
this fit into this is a glorified improv prompt. And the whole purpose of the token economy was to kind of give it a sense of how do we know when we're done? How do we know when we've done enough of this? And at the end of the scene, based on certain triggers, you would add to the household. So you would add a broken window if the kid hadn't been entertained, or you would add a new item to the puzzle room if they had. And I liked this in that I would love to put together 5 or 6 of these prompts as a way to show how to do mage slice of life. Like, this is what it's like in a chantry. This is what it's like in an astral court. This is what it's like talking to the dead. And nothing necessarily comes out of it directly. It's not pertinent to the plot per se, but it does provide a lot of development, and that token economy gives you an idea of when this should be done by. Because I think we've all also had that scene where we're like, how long are we going to talk to the shopkeep?
yeah. Oh God.
Yeah.
Because people always just keep coming up with questions about like things that the shopkeep probably has no idea.
Exactly. And this generic feeling that if we dig long enough, we have to find
Yeah.
something. No, there doesn't have to be a pony, a horse, and all that shit.
Yeah. But I like the slice of life too. Like I'm always curious what the chore wheel looks like in a chantry, for example.
Yeah.
Like maybe Magdalena Bonnie Gerbaton didn't clean the dishes this week because she accidentally erased her own face. Things like that.
I mean,
know?
who among us hasn't?
Well, right. And I admire that with all of the nose wiggling and the carrot distribution that you were doing, you did find time to intercut these like deep philosophical Lapine existentialism things.
I do like the idea of a member of House Scope saying that there is an adjacent reality where they have already cleaned the floor, so why should this version of them have to?
Yeah.
So I can get behind that.
Just as a brief tangent, again, connecting rabbits with like,
When we do Porthos bed and breakfast, I think this is going to be great.
I told Charles I wanted to write for the erotic mage stuff. Dante does Dwasatep, but that's a separate conversation. So like Watership Down, the novel, when I was reading it as a kid, that was a great introduction to like the literature of the world, because Richard Adams opened each chapter with a quote from something, and like chapter 1 is from The Libation Bearers by I think Aeschylus.
Okay.
And it's like the chorus and Cassandra going back and forth, and it's like, why do you cry out thus, unless at some vision of horror? The house reeks of death and dripping blood. How so? 'Tis but the odor of the altar sacrifice. The stench is like the breath from a tomb. And you're reading about rabbits,
Yeah.
so that's a vibe I can get behind.
So that framework of how do we improv something but kind of have an idea of when it's done, I thought was kind of cool.
Yeah.
And as you mentioned, the Chantry Chur wheel, it would be neat if at the end of the scene of it, there is some weird persistent thing that we add to the Chantry. The dust elemental that no one can quite get rid of.
Yeah.
The bottle of milk that always refills itself somehow. And we just get these weird little glitches and oddities.
I don't think echoes should always be a flaw.
No.
And this is
Yeah.
a case where that, especially if it's like at the chantry level, like there should just be quirks.
I strongly agree.
Yeah. Filing it away for Storyteller's Vault
Yeah,
futures.
I don't think I'm glad I didn't back the Kickstarter.
Okay.
The other thing about it is it had this legacy system whereby as you picked up characters and as they spent and used tokens, there are certain character milestones that allowed you to then define something further about the character. So like one character was basically a bard with writer's block.
Oh.
And one of the ideas was he was always writing, and one of the triggers you could be sing a song of at least 2 verses that describes how your character feels. And if you did that, you could define the bard's instrument or something like that. And I thought that was neat. I also like this as a framework for you have that chantry, you have that world, and a character isn't in a scene, but now Pook gets to play this common NPC sorcerer that's running around with us, or this hyper-intelligent cat familiar that's lost its mage. And that as it just does things, we get to define a little bit more about this NPC. And that's also a pacing mechanic, because you'll run into a thing where a particular puissant role player will seemingly define everything about an NPC, and you're like, well, that's not, I wanted that to go. This is from the same company that did Wander Home, which, depending on who you ask, is even more or even less freeform than than this game, and I haven't gotten a consistent answer out of that.
All right.
Yeah.
Well, speaking of what I would imagine is less freeform, the next on the list is Cyberpunk 2077.
Cyberpunk 2077 was the game that reminded me that as I've gotten older, I have gotten less numb to violence.
Oh, all right.
It was just, there was a combat scene and I just felt uncomfortable in my skin, where it's like, yeah, these are corporate dupes, but like these are corporate dupes with families. I don't want to just like ice them. And the thing I did like, though, was the number of little subsystems that you had. And one of them was basically to hack into a person. And once you do, there was a difficulty roll you could do. And if you succeeded, you got in. But if they also succeeded, they knew you were in. And then once you had done so, you had a certain number of moves that you could do activities, like you could shut down a person's ability to hear or to see because they were presumed to have cybernetic implants that controlled those things. Or you could cause them to have like a hemorrhage or something like that. And I kind of wish the Mind Sphere worked this way. I think it would be really neat to have that little subsystem where you break into a person's head. Now you're in there. Do they know that you're in there? Once you're in there, what are some of the things you can do? Like, you may not be able to cause a cerebral hemorrhage at low levels, but maybe you have the ability to trigger auditory hallucinations, and that does this, this, and this.
Yeah.
And it makes the Mind Sphere a bit broader in terms of it not just being persuade or convince or muddle around with memories. But like, I would like to see that hacking system, like hacking a mainframe and modifying someone's memory, to me feel a little bit analogous. And I think it would be super neat to do that. And you could keep the cyberpunk cladding and do something almost similar to the movie Inception in terms of saying, oh, we have a technomantic focus. This is how I'm going to bring other people in for this. And the two things it does is a lot of Mind Sphere stuff is either way too hard or way too easy.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas
Mind One.
Yeah, Mind One does all the things.
Yeah.
And the problem is, over the course of M20, what the Mind Sphere does has changed strangely. Where in the core book, it was sense, nudge, read, influence, rewrite. As of Book of the Fallen, it becomes more Mind 2 is get someone to do something they would do anyway. Mind 3 is get someone to do something they're indifferent towards. Mind 4 is convince them. And Mind 5 is rewrite their personality. So like, we have these two different presentations of what the Mind Sphere does. And I think just having a little booklet that's like adventures in mindscapes.
Well, to your point about mini games, so you make me think about when I was playing in Scott K's Trinity game, and it was Aeon game. It was fully in the Aeon setting, but which one was it now? Anima was coming out as we were playing. So we had one session where we did an Anima mini game within the game.
Yeah.
And it worked. I mean, systems wise, it was the same system, more or less. We had to create new characters and have this entire game within a game. And that's something to connect back to the idea of Mage being an everything game, a kitchen sink kind of thing. I do feel like there are those opportunities, not just to add systems for things like how do you hack someone's brain, but hey, this session is an entire sub game where all the rules are maybe not different, but like, don't worry so much about arete. Don't worry so much about these things you're used to worrying about. Here's this little 1-page additional rule set we're going to deal with this time, and we're going to go deep on this topic. It's something that I also think you could do. Probably there's like one of those per sphere or one of those per tradition that you could like really get into.
And I mean that the anima dealing with the net rules, that would be interesting, that to have a little sub character sheet for your digital web icon.
Yeah.
And okay, you have the data sphere or you have forces plus correspondence. You're able to change your character in a way that I'm not. But yeah, to be like, hey, for the purposes of this game, your spheres now allow you to do this, this, and this. Mm-hmm. So for instance, life can't heal your digital web icon, but it can help you renew your willpower by reinforcing the flesh that is allowing you to have this thing, and so on. And time doesn't necessarily allow you to slow down time, but it does allow you to increase your dice pool because you're slowing down the cognitive processes, and it lets you think through things more specifically. It would be fun to, as you mentioned, just do something a little bit different within the same game for one session. And that was kind of what I got from there. The other thing is it just reminded me of, I don't like settings where life is cheap. And midway through the combat, I'm like, is there a way to just kind of end this? Because like, and it was weird because the other characters were like, yeah, finish him, blow his head off.
Oh, I hate that.
And I'm like, ooh, I'm not. And it wasn't just that's not the game I wanted to play. It was a much deeper response. It was a much more visceral response within me where I'm like, I'm disgusted by that, despite the fact that I know that in a lot of games, kill all the orcs is the goal. There was just kind of something about the cyberpunk setting and maybe the satire of it that I just really rebelled against in my own little way.
I get the feeling that those were maybe people who weren't picking up the satire.
The other thing I liked was, and apparently this is the thing that changed in Cyberpunk over time, was the amount of stuff in the game that was branded.
Oh. That
you didn't just have ocular implants. They were the Vision Tech Pro.
Oh, interesting.
And that created a really interesting mouthfeel to me. Like, oh, wow, everything in this game is branded. There is no point at which you're talking about generic anything. Everything has a corporation or a syndicate or a firm behind it. And I'm wondering, like, what Mage would be like if it were like that. And in the earlier technocratic books, it was like that. You drank erg soda, erg cola.
Oh, good old erg.
Yeah. And I kind of miss that to some extent. It would be interesting that if part of the thing that gave you the feel of the technocracy is like, no. This isn't just chameleon armor. This is Kaleidoscape brand, color changing tactical equipment or something like that. And I think that creates a really interesting feel, as you say, whether or not you pick up the satire of it. And that to me is an interesting knob. And you get into a really weird place where what if the traditions did the same thing? Mm-hmm. Like this weird way, it's like, oh, you're sacrificing this brand of animal. Well, I'm doing this to make sure that the harvest is successful. And I just kind of liked, again, I'll use the term mouthfeel to describe that.
With the two caveats, maybe that first, you don't want the player to feel like they're missing some essential piece of the setting if you're throwing a name in there. Like, make it clear that it's just a goofy name you're throwing in. And then also don't try to be too amusing. Like, not every pun is going to land. Accept it.
No, but that's kind of what I got from Cyberpunk. The other thing I did like was Cyberpunk had, for the storytellers that were running games, they were all given this big book of playmats. It was C-size paper, so 11 by 17. And it just had a whole bunch of places. And I'm like, man, I'd love that for Mage, even though it's not a tactical miniatures game, but just to be like, oh, this is the Library of Duizatep. This is the Table Kentacle. And throughout Mage history, we have a few of those, just not a lot.
Yeah.
Like, oh, this is what the Euthanatoi Marabout looks like. Oh, this is what the Celestial Chorus Place of Worship looks like. Oh, this is what the bar in the digital web looks like. I think it would be neat to have that kind of book of maps, because it also, one of the shortcomings I find in a lot of storytellers is providing enough detail about the world that players know what they can poke and prod at. And having a map where it says bookshelf implies that there are books on a bookshelf. And if a player wants to, they can go ask what's on the bookshelf, and the storyteller, if they feel so moved, can come up with something, or just not.
Vintage Czech erotica.
Yeah. The Order of Hermes hornbook or something like that. Not nearly as fun as you want it to be. So, but yeah, that kind of world building that gives you detail that on one level is there, but kind of need to be reminded of to have it brought into the game. I think it would be neat to have that book of maps. And Nate Seaver from 2D10 did do a book of those locations for Vampire. I'd be curious to see what those look like for Mage.
Yeah. And that's the kind of work which, as a storyteller, I love doing on my own, but I understand that not everybody has the time or inclination.
Yes, I love doing it when I have 4 hours to sit down to map a single room that the characters will be in for 10 minutes.
Yes. And who doesn't?
Yeah.
So what about Through the Breach?
Through the Breach is the game based on the tactical skirmish miniatures game Malifaux. And the thing that I liked about this was at the beginning of the game, you drew a certain number of cards from a special tarot deck, and they were numbered, I think, 1 through 13 or something like that. And the storyteller would stipulate a difficulty, and you would have a attribute and an ability, and then you would add a random draw from this deck. If you did not like your random draw, though, you could manipulate fate. And you could substitute one of the cards that you had for the one that was drawn in the deck, and that would burn the card until a certain event had happened. So at the start of the game, I started with 4 cards. I'd say it was a 2, a 9, an 11, and a 13. So I have 1 bad result and 3 pretty good results. Now, the interesting thing was you did the substitution after you drew. So unlike spending a point of willpower, you didn't have to declare it up front. The other thing is there are certain times where you want a bad score. So for instance, there is a friendly fire mechanic. If combat kind of got too harried, you could accidentally shoot a player on your own team and you would want then a low result. And
especially if they were grappling you.
Yeah. Ugh, fucking elves. And the storyteller, I think, had a standard 52 card deck where the Twist of Fate cards, I think, were from a 78 card tarot deck. I don't believe it was 78 cards because I don't think there were trumps. So I think it was probably a 56 card deck where you added back in the page or something, or the knight. I guess it would be the knight is the face card that we're missing. And once the table went through all the cards, so once you had rolled 56 times or whatever it was, everyone got a new Twist of Fate card added to their Twist of Fate hand. And to me, I started thinking of, so we have Cyberpunk, which gives us this alternate mind system. What if this is the alternate system for entropy? Where at the beginning of a session, I have entropy X. I pre-roll 6 dice that I can substitute in as the game goes through. At entropy 1, I can only use it on social effects. On entropy 2, I can use it on social and mental. At entropy 3, social, physical, and mental. Entropy 4, I can start substituting it with the storyteller rolls. So now my low numbers I can kind of swap out. And it just gave me that as an idea. The other thing it had me thinking about is, what is the term, in terms of feel, what is the difference between guaranteed success, getting to re-roll, getting to substitute a value, or getting to spend points to add to a roll? And it really got me thinking about how those feel different.
Yeah.
Like re-rolling is fun, but people seemingly felt real cool when they substituted the card. When they said, no, I didn't draw a 6, I drew an 11. And even though it was part of the rules, there was this smirk on everyone's faces like they were getting away with something.
Yeah.
And that was real neat. And that is different than when you spend momentum points in a 2D20 game to re-roll a 20-sided die. So that really got me thinking on what that feel is. And also made me think about, what if mages were less actively magical and were more passively magical? And this may evolve into my system for mortals born in the Umbra. So that have this kind of magical background to them. They're not true mages necessarily, but they're not quite mortal either. And one of them was the substitution system. The other thing about Malifaux is the number of times in the game where I'm like, are we just doing a colonialism? And the storyteller's like, yeah, we're doing a colonialism. And I'm like, can we not?
Wow.
Yeah. The other thing were a few of the setting bits. One of them was that there were 2 societies in the game. One that is trying to explore Malifaux, this weird other place, and another one that is trying to exploit. And I picture in Mage there being a new Otherworlds area that had its own denizens that at one point mages went to and plundered in some way. The portal to this other place closed, and no one knows what happens to those mages. But that portal is open again. What do we do? Knowing that the last time that we sent a bunch of people over to plunder, they all went away. But this area seems rich in wonders and quintessence and bygones and whatever, and seems to have the remains of some past culture. I think that would be a real neat realm to build.
I mean, there's obvious Changeling parallels there too.
Go on.
So,
in what sense?
well, just I mean, the shattering and the gates to Arcadia slamming shut and then reopening and the consequences therein.
I don't know that you have an actual answer, but does Arcadia exist to you, or is it like the formless chaos?
I think it exists.
Okay.
Beyond that, I don't really feel any compulsion to define it or let players have any kind of concrete connection to it or anything.
The more time I spend thinking about it, the less Arcadia to me is a place more than it is like the formless void, that periodically enough energy coalesces that something comes out of Arcadia. But
yeah, well, I think that the best parallel to it in Mage is Ascension, in the sense of it kind of loses its power once you define it, and no player should ever ascend, probably. Like, once you ascend, you're done playing.
Yeah.
So if you go to Arcadia, you're done playing.
Okay.
But that's my take. I know other people have different interpretations of it.
I like the notion of what does it mean for a thing to come out of Arcadia?
And for that question is it actually coming out of Arcadia?
Yeah.
And then, because obviously there are many Arcadia, so...
The thing I also liked about it was there weren't really any evil races. It was just there were these weird necrosynthetic entities that people kept making. So it was real easy to be like, yeah, that's a bad guy.
All right.
And I didn't have to worry about, like, it did not, since these were weird necrosynthetic abominations who probably didn't want to be alive in the first place, it did not trigger the same response I had in Cyberpunk 2077 when they're like, yeah, kill the corpo. And I'm like, but I'm a corpo in real life.
Wow. Yeah.
But yeah, that alternative entropy thing. And what would it mean for a realm that mages had lost access to open up again and be full of treasure and danger? And how could we add that to Mage? And what would that realm be?
I would like it to be on a comet.
I think that's reasonable.
Swing through once every 800 years or whatever.
I feel like there was a book that attempted, in the same way that you have the Shard and Shade realms tied to planets, that, like, what if other celestial bodies had a thing? I think the closest we got was in Tradition Book Society of Ether, Tradition Book Sons of Ether, where we get Merzaba, which is just filled with dwarves and elves and other, like, Tolkien-esque fantasy races that, like, wave at us as it goes by, and you're like, what the shit? Anyway.
Didn't Infinite Tapestry have, like, some of the other celestial bodies kind of...
It may have. I would need to go through again. It is weird how much I remember, and it is weird how much I forget. The number of times where I'm like, surely the detail that I'm remembering came from this book, when actually it was a extended conversation that you and I had on a Tuesday, and I am now just attributing to the source material.
I do feel like those books probably rewrite themselves with not just our conversations, but everybody in the fandom's conversations when we're not looking.
Yeah, I think that's reasonable. Kind of like the notion of, what is the thing in Changeling where it's really hard to write down Changeling history, where the words seemingly move across the pages.
The mists?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And what is it? Memoriam is your kind of ability to pierce that or something? Remembrance, sorry.
Well, remembrance is like your connection to your past incarnations, your memories of Arcadia, etc. The mists are more, well, yeah, we don't need to get into separate conversation.
Well, when we start our Wraith game, we'll start talking about Memoriam.
Perfect. So tell me about Stealing Stories for the Devil.
Stealing Stories for the Devil was the most stressful game I've ever watched.
Okay.
It is a Monty Cook game where the interesting thing about it is it did a couple interesting things mechanically. The idea is you're on a spaceship and you're hunting down reality instabilities across time and space. And the one we had to do was there was a vial of some material that was creating this reality instability zone. And that once we retrieved it and brought it back to the ship, the reality instability zone would collapse. And the whole idea behind this was you could be as destructive as you wanted to be, because assuming that you brought the object back, reality would just kind of fix itself. So if you knock down buildings in the course of doing this or lit the planet on fire, as long as you got that object back, reality would kind of repair itself. And you were one of three types of liars. You could lie to objects, you could lie to people, or you could lie to the past.
Ooh.
And the way the story worked, we had a 2-hour session. And in talking to the storyteller, every session, it was a 3-hour session. Every session either took 45 minutes or it took all of his strength to have it end in 3 hours. And I could see him go through the process of trying to pace our game. And it just, I had induced anxiety watching him being like, come on, man, you can do it. I believe in you. You can come up with the complication that we need. The neat thing for Mage that I could potentially steal was...
Not that, hopefully.
No. The anxiety is already there in me. One of the things that I thought was interesting was when you decided to use your superpower, it always worked. The question was, how much stress would it put on you? And based on how difficult the change would be, the storyteller would set a difficulty. And if you rolled above that number, you were fine. So if I wanted to lie to the past and say, actually, there was a bowl of breath mints here because I need that for whatever reason to create a distraction, that's difficulty 1. Okay, you need to roll at least a 2 on the 6-sided die, and we will be fine. And as you progressed in the game, the die that you use would increase in terms of size, so you could eventually have difficulty 10 and 11 things. If you didn't roll, that change still occurred. Your character was just injured. And the way injury worked was every time you then did anything else, you rolled an injury die with it. And it was a 10-sided die. And on the 1, there was like a little glyph to indicate that you had failed. So you had more or less 3 hit points before your character was incapacitated. But each time you did something, you would roll a number of dice equal to the total injuries you had accumulated so far. And if any of those came up with the injury icon, you would fail. And that was interesting. And I'm like, what if magic worked the same way, where your effect always worked, but it took an amount of willpower, health, or quintessence equal to this difference if you failed. So you're like, okay, you need 7 successes to do this. You have a rete 2. You can still do this. It's just going to hurt a lot.
I like that, yeah.
And that system of personal sacrifice was kind of interesting. I also like the idea of this interesting framework where you are technocratic chrononauts and you have to remove these objects of instability from across time and space. And it was interesting because you got to... There was a scene where you got to deck yourself out and stuff before you left, and you could have any amount of mundane material and 1 or 2 like hypertech objects with you to do it. Like you could say, yeah, I want a nano reassembler that'll allow me to masquerade as anyone that I've seen and heard speak before, or something like that. And you basically had this big list of powers that you could draw from, and that was interesting. The box also included a whole bunch of floor maps that were not to scale, but just gave you ideas. And it could be something like library from the 32nd century, 1990s technology campus, medieval fortress. It was just a real big spread. And I'm going to point to it on my shelf and people at home can't see it, but that box, Stealing Stories for the Devil.
My God, it's massive.
Yeah, a lot of that is just maps.
It's also the deluxe edition.
It is. The regular one doesn't have the maps.
Yeah.
The other thing you got at the beginning of the story were 3 kind of meta-narrative cards that allowed you to nudge the system. One was you could turn a partial success into a full success, or a failure into a partial success, or a catastrophe into a failure. Those were kind of neat. And a few other things like I just happen to have the exact thing that we need on me, and that would give you access to any mundane item or what have you. And I like those in the same way that when we were playing Invisible Suns, I think playing the ephemeral objects and the incantations were some of the most fun parts, because you're like, I had no idea this was going to be useful, yet here we are.
I know you've made the point before that when you look at a character's sheet and you see where they put their dots, you're like, okay, these are where they want the story to go. I'm going to make sure.
And I think that's something I originally got from Eddie Webb, but yeah.
Okay. But I think it speaks to that same thing. It's like, if I have this random thing that I, as the player, can't imagine when I would ever use that, the storyteller can look at that and say, I know what hook I can do for this.
Yeah. And when you do, the player feels like a genius.
Yeah, exactly.
You feel like you pulled something curious off. So I think it would be neat if part of what defined Mage were certain access to meta-narrative changes like that, where once per arc you would have the card, we're not really as antagonistic as you think. And you reveal why this character, this NPC that supposedly was going to kill you, you're actually friends or standoffish with, or it's not going to be nearly as bad as you thought it would be. And I think that is fun because I like the out of character get out of jail free card every once in a while. I think it's fun. It allows you to kind of like nudge your elbow at the person next to you at the table. And that was fun. But figuring out the length of a Stealing Story for the Devil session seems like it would be wildly difficult.
All right.
Yeah. And that is a thing I would not want to steal.
Yeah. Your point about the sort of self-sacrifice aspect of Magic too, something that I do actually like about V5 is that they've brought in things like aggravated willpower damage. I like that aspect. I like having more health tracks, so to speak, because there is that strong tradition in Magic, and you don't really get a good way to model it when you just have like 7 health levels, I guess. So
and the only
like,
one we have is Prime 1, where you can turn health points into
exactly.
Yeah. And you say health tracks, and it takes a while to get people used to the idea that health is just another resource that can be spent. And my basic example of this is going to be, you're on the roof of a building, you have your choice of dealing with the inhabitants of the building, or you just take fall damage. And people would be like, well, my character would never. Well, I'm like, well, it's only 4 stories or 5 stories. You're only going to roll 4 dice. At worst, you take 4 points of damage, and now you're at wounded or whatever it is. And you get to skip whatever bad thing could have happened in the building. And people have difficulty thinking about that. Health is just another resource.
Yeah.
And I think anything that brings us towards it, which I think V5 does pretty well with the willpower and then aggravated willpower damage, play around with.
So the next one, I hope that the system that you're going to say would be good for Mage is using runes instead of dice, because this is Fate of the Norns. And I have yet to actually play a game of it, but I spoke with Andrew at PAX last year. I have the Irish one on my shelf, and I quite like it. But what was your...
They were sold out of Eru or Ire or whatever the thing was. So the one thing I got from them was actually the companion book that goes through Irish mythological creatures.
That's the one I didn't buy at PAX.
And I paid far too much for
Yes.
it. And we're not going to talk about that anymore. But the two things, one, I really liked the opening for it, where the guy is like, across Scandinavia, the Skywolves have consumed the sun and the moon.
I mean, go big or go home.
Ragnarok erupts all around you. And we're like, ooh. He goes, but you were in Ireland and you were facing a different, culturally unique apocalypse. And I just really liked that opening. And it talked about the person, girl, you find yourself a man that loves you as much as the guy who ran this setting loved Fate of the Norns. And the things he did, he had such utter mastery of the system that you could just tell there was no question you could ask him that would throw him off. And the rune drawing system was kind of neat, where at the beginning of each turn, you would draw a certain number of runes and you could dedicate them towards objects. And to do certain abilities, you just had to spend a rune. But if the rune was the same color as the ability, you got a bonus. And if it perfectly matched the type of rune that you needed, like let's make an analogy to Scrabble. Say in Mage, when you did something, you had to play a Scrabble tile. And social abilities or combat abilities would be magnified if you spent a vowel. And if it was a manipulation ability and you spent an A, you got a further bonus.
Just so you know, while part of my brain is listening to you, another part of my brain is inventing an entire Scrabble system for Mage on the side.
As friend of the show Chaz says, when Scrabble is localized, it reveals to you what a language is like. In Czech, the letter Z is worth 1 point.
Aha. With or without the little...
Yeah, that I don't know. I don't know how they deal with diacritics.
Aha.
So one of the things this storyteller did that I loved was round 1, we could only use basic abilities. Round 2, we could use basic abilities and simple character-specific abilities. Round 3, we could use our superpowers, more or less. And the idea of running a mage game where it's like, okay, this session you can only do coincidental effects. Or you can only do mundane effects, and maybe mundane effects helped by magic. Session 2, you can do coincidental. Session 3, you can do vulgar. And I just liked that as a slow way of introducing us to systematic complexity that was within the game. The other thing I liked was the idea of how does a culture respond to the weird that's happening. And a thing that happened in this is one of the characters was a devotee of the nailed god, which was to say Christian, and I was a worshiper of the Morrigan. So I had built up all these little bennies that allowed me to really influence a single social role. So I was having, after we had done our combat scene, I had a back and forth with the bishop, the Catholic bishop, and the storyteller, and we're talking about what it was like being out there, the mists that are slowly enshrouding the worlds, the weird massive creatures that we see at the edge of our vision moving as shadows upon the hills.
Like you do.
As you do. And the storyteller is like, okay, you've built up like a plus 17 modifier. You get to ask the bishop one question. And my response was, I'm like, I have my one question. What's that? Where is your God now? And I mean, it didn't change anything in the story except for like I caused a crisis of faith in a bishop, which is someone who was raised Catholic. Not going to lie, that was the wish fulfillment I didn't know I needed.
You take that opportunity wherever you can.
Exactly. Kind of the thing that I would want to steal is I do like the idea of breadth and depth being different things that you roll for. And it would be interesting that, for instance, again, coming back to basic systems, what if Prime allowed you to roll extra dice with your Arete? So you would roll Arete plus Prime, but you only got to pick your Arete and dice. Or something like that. So with Prime 3, I have an Arete of 4 or something like that. I'm rolling 7 dice. I only get to pick 4 of them. But that becomes the subsystem for Prime, as we talked about the subsystem for mind being hacking and the subsystem for entropy being dice selection on mundane activities. So that was one thing that was kind of rolling around in the back of my head. The other one was this idea that when you, maybe each sphere has a die value that is always a success or something like that, or gives you a bonus. Like whenever you're rolling matter and you roll an 8, that counts as 2 successes or something like that. Or you get to add this thing, hey, if you roll 2 8s with matter, remove 1 point of paradox that this effect would have otherwise triggered, or bleed off 1 roll. So kind of more things to play around with the dice and the dice values.
Do you think it's important when designing things like that? Because, I mean, even just kind of introducing that as a concept, like you can rattle off a dozen possibilities one after another. How important do you think it is to try and strive for some kind of mechanical balance between them?
I would go for mechanical balance. The question to me is it something where if you aren't really good at the system, that's okay?
Okay, yeah.
I don't want to punish. Like, one of the things I like about Mage is it doesn't have system mastery in the same way that other games do. Now, you will come up into these cases where players build characters where you're like, that's just kind of stupid. Like, no one out the gate needs 1 dot of matter and 2 dots of prime. Like, that doesn't, I would always switch those two. So there is something in terms of like the quote unquote ideal build, as it were. But yeah, I would try and balance them at least narratively, or at least I would try and have it so that there wasn't a given one that kind of blew the doors off of things. And this would allow us to do some after the fact balancing where it's like, well, prime is kind of a lame sphere and mind is doing too much. So these additional powers that we're going to add, mind isn't going to be hot shit and prime is going to be a little bit cooler than all the other ones. And that's kind of one way of doing it.
Yeah.
So just more things to play with the dice optionally for people who want a little more crunch.
Well, that's the thing is that I mean, people like to diss on Prime in particular.
Well, I don't think they're dissing on it. I think they're just pointing out that it doesn't seem to do as much.
I think it depends on the kind of story you're running, but that's me. The other thing too, though, about the having round 1, round 2, round 3, part of that to me is having kind of constraints on the vast possibilities that Mage offers. I think that actually generates maybe not better role-playing, but good role-playing in and of itself, because it forces you to really think through how you're going to, forces 4 can't solve all your problems. What do you do now? Like that kind of thing. I stand by my conviction that the most interesting Mage games are Arete 1 and 2, because you have to really think about what you're working with and really plan out how you're going to make it work. And so adding additional options for the spheres, adding different things you can do with dice, maybe you're trading some of that raw power for a little bit more complexity, which I like, but
and potential elegance.
Yeah.
Because to me, it reinforces. I guess a question is: are mages powerful, weird, or both? And being able to manipulate dice, to me, on a meta narrative level, really makes it feel like I'm dicking with reality.
Yeah.
To be like that 5 is now a 2.
Or it's like when you do dramatic editing in Trinity.
Yeah.
So,
but yeah, it has me thinking about what are neat little dice mechanics that we can add to the game that make it a little more interesting. And one of my issues is at low Arete, like I would modify your statement that I think low sphere level games are interesting, 1 and 2 dots. But when you only have 1 or 2 dice to roll, I just don't really find that hugely fun. It doesn't have great mouthfeel to me. So like, yeah, what if you only have 1 or 2 dots in a sphere, but you get 5 dice?
All right, that's fair.
Yeah, or something like that. And that's just me. So Fate of the Norns got me thinking about that. The other one is, how do we localize creatures? So the author had a couple of books, and I still want to go through that, and I'll probably do an interview with the author to say, hey, how do we do this? In America, and I imagine most of the globe, one of the nice things we have to play with are urban legends. we get to put those into their game. And like, there's a non-zero chance that if I'm running a convention game and I have an angel in my game, there is someone there who in a very deep, abiding way feels that Michael Archangel exists and that they would be able to pray to them. And I don't always want to add that to a game.
Yeah.
So one of the things I like, for instance, about Revised Dream Speakers, for all its flaws, is it has a lot of urban spirits. It has the Ghost Wheel Society.
My faves.
Yeah. And those are things I can play with. And I have to do a lot of work to make them offensive in comparison to a lot of the other options I could use where I take a mythological creature where it's like, oh, I'm turning this into a monster, where actually for this culture, it's a creature of justice and restoring the balance or something like that. And I have just reduced the Arinyes to the force of nemesis in the world. And I've really kind of flattened what could be something really interesting there. By dealing with contemporary spirits, I'm not as worried about that in the same way that a lot of people feel comfortable talking about, say, for instance, the Egyptian or the Babylonian pantheon, because there aren't a lot of worshipers of those faiths to get offended.
The cool thing about Fate of the Norns, too, when I spoke with the author, he's very knowledgeable about Baltic mythology. And that's like,
shut up and take my money.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, like, so I think it might actually be one of the setting books, but I mean, we were just talking about, and he was like rattling off gods and creatures and stuff. I'm like, I've never heard of any of these anywhere.
Yeah.
And that was part of the motivation. He was like, it was such an unaddressed corner that he wanted to, because that's his background.
And that's also an interesting place because we have a thing I wasn't even aware of before I did Mage the Podcast was the idea of the history of the cunning folk. Of people that knew a little bit more. And that I feel more comfortable kind of playing around with. Someone out there worships Thor. Do I just want to have Thor appear in my story? No. But if Chernobog or the Vortz sisters are just kind of these things out there that no one worships, but everyone kind of knows about, I feel a little bit more comfortable bringing it into the story. If I do anything wrong, I don't necessarily feel like I'm going to be stepping in it.
Yeah.
And so to just learn more cultures that have more of those things, to have the spectrum from, this is something we tell our kids about to make sure that they go to bed on time, all the way up to this creature is divine. We don't even say their name. Mm-hmm. Out of respect. It's nice to have more and more things to fill in those first few rungs where you really get a taste for a culture and what their concerns were without necessarily offending someone. So Fate of the Norns, the feeling I get going through, again, that creature book is it really has that spread. It doesn't spend a lot of time on the Morrigan themselves, which were objects of worship and reverence seemingly. I say this just because I'm not a practitioner and I don't know anyone personally who does. So I don't want to be excessively dismissive of it to be like, they were just these weird raven women or something like that. But anyway, just to have more things that are like, this is something that someone would tell a campfire story about, I think is hugely beneficial.
So last but not least, or presumably not least, is Twilight Inscription.
This is gonna be bonus content.
So maybe last and least in that case.
So Josh Heath, friend of the show, signed me up to play Twilight Inscription, which he thought was an RPG based on Twilight Imperium. And I said, what kind of game is it? And he said, roll and write. So we thought it was going to be something like 1,000-Year-Old Vampire, where a thing happens in the world and then you tell me how you feel. No.
Okay.
It was not that at all. Your character sheet, everyone in the game was a different civilization within the world of Twilight Imperium, which is this vast future science fiction setting, of which there are 40 annoyingly unique races or groups that have rich, dense backstories. And your character sheet was 4 pieces of paper that was just dense with icons. And the way the game worked is the person running it revealed a card. A thing happened within the world. You got a certain number of resources to spend. You would then choose which aspect of your culture you were focusing on, exploration, industry, or diplomacy, or something like that. They would then roll some dice, and that would be the only card that you could deal with.
I mean, it sounds like the board game, only more onerous.
Less. We were able to play the full game. We probably could have gotten the full ass game, including instruction, in under 3 hours, which from what I understand, you cannot do with the board game.
No, the one time I've seen the board game played, I remember it was a group of friends. They started at noon. I showed up around 2:30 and they had just finished setting up and we're going through the rules. I was staying at the apartment of one of them. I got back to the apartment at like 9 p.m. They still hadn't gotten home by 12:30 in the morning. I went to bed. Apparently they rolled in around 2 and they never finished.
Some would say they're still playing the game. So the thing that I really took out of this, and the funny part is I accidentally tied for first place. I was just shit talking this game the entire time.
The fact that there's a first place to tie for is already a strike against it, in my opinion. But okay.
So it was a game where you did a mix of things between building your economy, building your military abilities, and securing victory points, which were the ultimate metric by which the game were done. One, it made me appreciate how tight board games are and how kind of loose role-playing games are and how games exist on a spectrum where you have Stealing Stories for the Devil, which is fantastically loose, but still notionally has a goal. So it is a step above improv prompt. And then you have something that's super tight for an RPG, which might be your Adventurers Guild for D&D, or my favorite, Blades in the Dark, or Aegon, where just kind of every system in the game points back at itself.
I'm sorry, what was the first one there that you like?
Blades in the Dark!
That's the one. There we go.
Or Aegon, where it is obvious that there is a direction you are going. The actions you take feed the XP, feed the money system. Everything in the game points back at something already in the game. Systems always point at systems. And role-playing can be done, but if you don't want to, you always have a system to fall back on. And I would love for Mage to have that kind of... I would love for Mage to have that board game-esque thing where you got to play an entire tradition. And like Pandemic or some other game, you're slowly trying to take over the world with your belief set. And the technocrats get certain benefits, and the Euthanatoi get certain benefits, and the traditions get certain benefits. I don't know at what scale.
I mean, it sounds a hell of a lot more interesting than Rivals, an expandable card game. So
the other thing I liked about it was the fact that we were all dealing with the same die roll. So it'd be pretty fascinating to me if there were a type of combat or a type of realm where the storyteller rolls 6 dice. And whatever you do that round, those are going to be your dice. But before the round starts, you would have to pick magic, mundane activity, or I don't know, something else. And I just think it would be interesting to be like, what does it look like when we all get 5 successes for whatever we're going to do? What do you then pick as your action? I did like the nature that everyone went at once. I don't like games where I'm waiting for someone else's turn.
Yeah.
And it was a good reminder to me that people like board games. One of the players at my table was wearing a shirt that said, yes, board games, no, not like Monopoly.
Been there, yeah.
So that was kind of fun. So the last one was kind of a joke based on the fact that I thought this was going to be an RPG. It fully was not.
Yeah.
Did I then finish it and kind of want to buy it? A little bit, maybe.
But there are interesting things too with dice mechanics in particular that are a pool of dice. I've always liked the ones where, so I don't know how you would make this work in Mage, for example, but like if you're drafting dice and it's like, you pick one, you go around the table, and then you go the other way. So then there's always the question of, is it more advantageous to be first and last or in the middle twice?
Yeah, the problem of a serpentine draft.
Yeah, and so depending on what kind of action you're trying to do that round and knowing that, okay, next round, I'm going to be the one who picks first, like you kind of have to work with that a little bit and say, okay, I'm going to take the one this time because I don't care if I botch on this whatever roll, but next turn, I know I want to go.
And the thing that I would love to see is we do that and you roll at the beginning of the round 8 dice. 6 are black dice and they can be used for whatever. 1 is a blue die, which only gets added to a retail roll. And then 2 more are mundane dice that can be added to any non-magical action. So based on that could help. You're like, oh, okay. Would I rather have my 4 mundane successes or my 4 successes I can do anywhere, 5 magical successes, or 7 mundane effects?
Yeah.
What makes more sense? And again, just being like, how does this change the game? What does it do? And I really think something like this could represent faction turns. You're like, okay, you and I were playing our game. We're talking about trying to prevent Mole Hectorus from rising from the underworld of Philadelphia. But at the same time, our action feeds into what is happening in the East Coast Traditions Alliance. And then we get to take a faction turn.
Good old Ecta.
Yeah. Yes. And then we get to see how the world changes from that. And then we get to zoom back in. I think that would be a neat thing to be able to add to Mage, to represent that Ascension War on the microcosm and the macrocosm. You and I have talked about, we both like street level, but our definition of street level is wildly different.
Yes.
I want it to be personal. It doesn't need to be low power for me, because I think there's a really rich vein of what is it like when there's an adept on your street or something like that. Because I think those can still exist there. And I think Awakening does a better job with that with Imperial Mysteries. But even though it was a board game, those are the ideas that it had me thinking about in pursuit of those topics.
Would you say that overall these 7 games were kind of giving you more systems and meta gaming ideas rather than like things you would specifically add to Mage as a world?
Largely, yes.
Okay.
So I was visiting James Sombrano the other week, and I was talking with one of their friends, and I'm like, what do you mostly play? And they said D&D. I said, when you're not playing D&D, what do you play? They said all sorts of things. And they're like, Pathfinder, MCDC, or something like that. I'm like, okay, what I would call F20 fantasy.
Other Ds and Ds.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it reminds me of Robin Law's statement of Dungeons and Dragons and role-playing are 2 separate hobbies. Sometimes people are interested in both, but let's not kid ourselves. Most people play D&D.
Yeah.
And when you look at every dollar that's spent on RPGs and you realize that 82 cents of it is spent on D&D, and that number has grown over time.
Part of that is also their books have gotten much more expensive, I imagine.
The MSRPs have increased. The actual price you pay on like Amazon has barely budged, which I think is impressive. Except for the premium editions. Yes, they have gotten better at that. And when, I can't remember who the CEO, Hasbro, was like, D&D is under monetized, and people were like, oh, or am I going to have to pay to buy a potion now? I'm like, there are a lot of ways to skim a little bit more off. Like, I have a few of the premium editions because I really wanted the premium Planescape, because I want a book plate with the Lady of Pain on it or what have you. But they were like, how do you play 15 games in a year? And I'm like, well, I'll go to Gen Con and I'll try 8 new games.
Yeah.
And once you've played enough games, you develop the shorthand vocabulary. Like, I would describe like D&D as F20, D20 based system with ability modifiers with multi-die combat. So sometimes you're rolling.
Right. I grok that as you say it. So yeah. And the same is true for board games too. Like people talk about them in terms of other ones.
Yeah. Like, this is a worker placement game, or this is a tile acquisition game or something like that. And all of them are going to have their unique spin.
This game is European.
This is a German game. Okay. What should I take from that? But anyway, I generally grab systems, and I'm looking at the conversation between system and world. Like, do I feel that these reinforce each other? And in a lot of cases, the answer is no. But the manipulating fate thing in Through the Breach or Into the Breach was one of the ones where I'm like, no, this really puts me into the world where I am a cunning and dastardly adventurer who escapes by the skin of my teeth due to my own canny. And the other one was kind of that hacking mechanic in Cyberpunk, where I'm like, no, I do feel like I'm in a guy's head.
Yeah.
And how do we bring that back to Mage?
Yeah, and that I like that idea of creating these kind of maybe not ad hoc systems, but things that don't quite align with like the storyteller system core mechanics, nor do they necessarily need to in order to demonstrate this aspect of the very expansive world that you want to make feel distinctive in some way. So
yeah, and I think you may call it a subsystem, you may call it a mini game, but they can all be optional. And in the same way that some people are thrown off by the fact that empathy, intimidate, what are the other two?
Leadership, expression,
but basically in social interactions you have 4 choices to make, and all of them can be simplified to persuade if you really want them to. But in the same way that firearms, melee, and martial arts could be collapsed to combat, your abilities are a vote on what you want the game to be. I have played games where politicking, chantry politics were both added to the character sheet because that's what the game was really focused on. And I didn't want to have one god stat to rule them all. I didn't want subterfuge to mean that you win. I wanted subterfuge and empathy were 2 very different things. Subterfuge was to conceal yours. Empathy was to kind of suss out theirs. I may have changed it to insight. I don't remember. But by adding a subsystem to a game, that is essentially a way of saying this is something neat and special that I want to have exist. So if you're going to have a game where you're constantly hacking into people's brains and so on, or modifying their dreams, I want a system for that. If I'm only ever going to do it literally once, am I fine just making it all things that Mine 3 can do? Yeah. But do I want to occasionally have access to the vast and detailed system of Veneromancy that we get in Changeling the Lost? Yeah. Does that mean that I think it's the better Changeling game? No. I think they're both unique and different.
Right answer.
Yeah. And I look forward to Changeling the Podcast, talking about those in the fullness of time, and having played a fair bit of Changeling the Lost at this point. If you need a co-host for any of those, give a holler.
Noted.
Yeah, noted.
Notables. Are you suggesting a bargain, Terry?
I don't know what the counter side to that would be.
I'll get back to you on that.
Okay, but no, it's good to have options. To quote one of my favorite Magic card flavor texts, Lightning Rift, options will cost you, a lack of options will cost you even more.
All right.
And that summarizes my syndicate nature.
My favorites are always the one they got from like real world poetry, but they don't do that anymore.
No, not really.
Yeah. No, they're like they put out a directive at some point. And
that they weren't.
It's a shame.
Do it. But yeah, it was weird to be like, oh, this is interesting. You're quoting Keats.
Well, I mean, like when I was in 7th grade, I think it was 7th grade, we read Rime of the Ancient Mariner, and I was like, oh, Scathed Zombies, Will-o'-the-Wisp. Like, I recognized all these little stanzas.
They work their stir, they all uprose, nor shake nor move their eyes. It would have been strange even in a dream to have seen those dead men rise. Yes.
About and reel and rout, the death fires danced at night. The water like a witch's oils burnt green and blue and white. There you go.
'Twas right, said they, such birds to slay that brought the fog and mist. Which is odd because it is a narrative poem that was in the book Lyrical Ballads. Dun dun dun. I too enjoyed Rime of the Ancient Mariner.
It was a good one.
Yeah. But yeah, that's what I picked up from Gen Con.
Well, I look forward to going there someday.
I hope you can join us. And I hope our master plan of bringing more Titter Pigs to PAX Unplugged is able to happen.
If the Norns are listening, may it be so.
And I guess one other thing is, Changeling the Podcast, when does your next season start or end? Like, what is the next milestone there? And what ongoing projects should people be aware of?
So we have built up a couple recordings. As of this recording today, the next one will drop in about 48 hours. We will be coming back from hiatus. So that's going to carry us through until probably November. Next season, we are laying the groundwork. The main thing is we have the Changeling 30th Anniversary Project, where we're trying to release one book every month in 2025. We're going to see how that goes. But yeah, changelingthepodcast.com. and changeling30.com. These are places where we live.
Pook, thank you so much for joining.
Thank you for having me.
This has been Mage the Podcast, where if you have a Mage one-shot, we're going to politely ask you 200 times to put it on the Storyteller Vault. But politely. This show has been made possible by our executive producers who help pay for my mobile recording rig, which has made a lot of these episodes doable. Join them at patreon.com/magethepodcast and help make this show happen. First, I'd like to recognize the oracles of the following notes on the games I played. Ben Bendelow, oracle the fact that everything in Cyberpunk is on a 2 meter by 2 meter grid. Buck Gregory, oracle the fact that the next Cyberpunk setting location is a book based on a computer game based on a book. Christopher Phillips, oracle of the characters in Yazeba's Bed and Breakfast trying to steal souls, but doing so kind of cheerfully. It was a little bit menacing. Guy Stewart, oracle of another character in Yazeba's being a lost elemental, which we never really talked about. Jay Widener, oracle of Into the Breach being a master of we just don't talk about that weird bit of the setting. Mikhail, oracle of Into the Breach seemingly having everyone low-key practicing necromancy, but necromancy being really forbidden, wink wink. Puka oracle of me staring in disbelief when someone kept insisting that you could use 5e for anything successfully. Sean Gallagher of me still thinking regularly back on the time where I was shot by an elf and died. The crew of Erebus, oracle of me saying I hate Twilight Inscription, but see craving playing again, please don't tell Josh Heath he has a copy and he really wants to play. Jason Vines, oracle of the way runes in Fate of the Norns look suspiciously like Hebrew characters in some cases. I think that was just the font they used. I'm not sure, there might be a tie there. Derek Semsek, oracle of the fact that the mission we did in Fate of the Norns was stealing a cow, making it the lowest stakes, high stakes adventure I've ever done. Drawn Cap, oracle of the fact that I missed my session of Big Eyes Small Mouth, where they were apparently giving out copies of the core rulebook, and when I told people, the universal response was, wow, you really dodged a bullet on that. Along with Archmaster Andrew Edelstein, Archmaster Brad the Blue, Archmaster Dan Svensson, Archmaster Leroy Bryce, Archmaster Morgan Aran, Archmaster Nathan Weaver, Alex, Alexia, Ambiversion, Andrews S., Anon, Badurfi, Berto, Blaze Hibbert, Blake Ryan, Brandon, Bryce Perry, Bubba the Pale One, Chris Blake, Sinshotis, Sig, Daniel Cuppin, Daniel Scribner, Darren Hennessy, David McFall, Dave Roy, Dennis Osborne, Eli Levenger, Eric Swank, Fragger Rock, George Laura, Gray Trillic H., Henry Kraft, Ia Bolt, Jason Duncan, Jason Kennedy, Jason W. Briggs, Jay Gatsby, Jeff Bryn, Jenna F., Jervis Johnson, John Magnuson, Joel Andes, Joshua Heath, Joshua Hillerup, Laws and Stuff, Kathleen Halperin, Kevin Fitzpatrick, Chris Kinner, Leslie Weatherstone, Manel Canos, Matthew Prohl, Maurice Hopkins, Melissa Krause, Michael Creedle, Michael Parker, Nibero, Neil Patterson, Nikita Klamanoff, Pax Cal, Patrick Mulder, Patrick McNamara, Rachel Grace, Ricardo, Richard Bat Brewster, Robart the Robot, Ryan Stray, Rob H., Ryan Kendi, Samuel Tobin, Seven Esses, Starfish, Stephen Carton, Steve Wynyard, That's Real Nito, Thrice Great, Tyler Bryan, Vincent Hamilton, Walter, William Conley, William Martin, and Wolf Larryson. Our EP shout-out is to Melissa Krause, whose name Krause, I believe, metonym for pitcher. So let's talk about some types of drink vessels that you should be using in your games. Ewer, a tall decorative jug with a spout typically used for pouring wine or water, often seen in ancient and medieval art. A pitcher, a standard jug with wide body and a spout, commonly used for serving drinks. Pitchers can come with or without a lid. Amphora, a two-handled jug with a narrow neck and a rounded body, commonly used in ancient Greece and Rome for storing oil, wine, or grains. Carafe, a specifically glass jug without a handle, typically used for serving water or wine at a table. Growler, a large, often ceramic or glass jug used for transporting draft beer. A Toby jug, the traditional English jug in the form of a seated person, typically used as a beer mug. I once saw an opera based on these and it was absolutely terrible. Hydria, a three-handled jug from ancient Greece, often used for carrying water. Two handles were for carrying and a third was for pouring. Stoneware jug, a robust, heavy jug made of clay, often used for storing liquids like whiskey or vinegar. When I think of strangely specific drinkware in my games, I'll think of you, Melissa. Rather listen on YouTube? Search Mage the Podcast on YouTube to find our full library there. If you super like this episode or super didn't, drop us a line at magethepodcast@gmail.com or at Mage the Podcast on Twitter. We have a hop in Discord community at discord.me/magethepodcast. If you like us, please give us a review on the platform of your choosing or tell a friend about us. Also go to magethepodcast.com for show notes and all of our previous shows. Now go change reality. Bye.
And that's Changeling. in a
Yeah,
nutshell.
the famed story of the city sock versus the country sock. Yeah.
I have seen the city. I have tasted life.